I've been reading a book recently, and I'm not through it, but there was one passage in it that I really started looking at, and it mentioned the story of Joseph. And the book is called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's by a guy named Stephen R. Covey, and it's a really, really good book so far, at least. I hope I don't recommend it, and then it has some kind of a completely off the wall thing later on. But what I've read so far, it's really good, and I would recommend it. But he talked in there about the story of Joseph, and it got me thinking, and so I went back and reviewed. Now, the story of Joseph, I'm not going to read to you because it comprises 13 chapters of the Bible, and there is nobody in here that wants me to sit here and read 13 chapters of the Bible to you. So I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version, and the Cliff Notes version is 2 pages, 1.5. So, yeah, that'll be fine. So here's basically what happened. I do encourage you. There's all kinds of stuff that I'm not going to be able to share with you that is in there. It's good little detail stuff. Genesis 37 through 50. It's a really good. There's tons of lessons to be learned in there. But I'm going to start you off here. Joseph is first mentioned in this story, and it kind of starts off bad. The first mention of Joseph is that he brings a bad report back to his dad about his brothers. Now, how many of you in here like a tattletale? Raise your hand. Nobody. Okay. So, nobody likes a tattletale. And so then he starts off telling these dreams that God has given. And these dreams are of all of them symbolically bowing down to him, including his dad and his stepmom. So it's kind of an awkward situation to start off with. Nobody likes him. Dad says he's the favorite, makes him this really fancy coat, and nobody else gets this big fancy coat. And back then that was a big deal because a coat was worth like a new car to us today. So his brothers come up with this great plan. In Genesis 37:15, they say, we're going to kill him. Good plan, right? So they threw him into a pit, and they decided after that to spare his life, and they ended up instead doing the best thing possible, of course, selling him into slavery. So he was sold to a group of people from Midian. They were Midianites, sold him to Potiphar, who was an officer of Pharaoh in Egypt. So Joseph was in a bad spot, starting off just right offhand. He was away from his homeland. He was away from his family. He was a slave. But we don't read anything about his mindset or attitude being wrong. We read that the Lord was with Joseph. That's a statement that recurs so often through this. The Lord was with Joseph. And everything that Joseph did prospered. He found favor in his master Potiphar's side and became his personal attendant. Potiphar trusted him so much that he put everything that he owned into Potiphar's hands. And Potiphar, because of this, became more wealthy and more blessed because of the blessing that God had on Joseph, and because Joseph was the man. He took care of business. So Joseph's on top of the world. Everything's going as good as could be expected, considering that your brothers had just plotted to kill you and then instead sold you into slavery. He's well esteemed by his boss. Anybody in here that has a boss knows that's a good thing. If your boss likes you, that's a pretty good thing. He's working well. Everything's being blessed that he puts his hand to. But everybody in here also knows it don't take long to go from the top to the bottom. All it takes is one instant. And Joseph was no different. It started with with Potiphar's wife. Joseph was a good-looking guy, and she noticed that. She basically asked him to sleep with her. Joseph did the right thing, refused, But she kept asking, day after day, and then came the wrong place at the wrong time. Joseph went in to do his job. He didn't do anything wrong, but there were none of the other servants around. It was him and it was her. She asked him again, grabbed a hold of him. He refused, ran off, but she had his garment that he had on. They basically just wrapped their stuff around him then. But he had his garment that he had on, and she grabbed it as he ran away. So now she has proof. And so then came the lie. She told all the servants that Joseph tried to sleep with her. She'd screamed and he ran away. And she told Potiphar, her husband, the same story. Potiphar got mad. Joseph went to jail. He went from good standing with a wealthy government official to being thrown in a hole in a day's time. Now, it's one thing to be on the bottom and to stay there. It's one thing to be, or it's another thing to be okay with your family, and then to get thrown into a pit, be on the bottom, and then to rise back up and be doing okay, and then get thrown back into the pit again. Joseph had every right here to stop trying it all, and to just flat out pitch a fit, have a full pity party. He had everybody to blame. He had his brothers, he had his dad, the Midianites, his co-workers, the household servants, Potiphar's wife, the legal system that let him be thrown in jail. Whoever else was around, he could blame anybody. But we don't see any of that about Joseph. Instead, we read again, the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with him. Well, you would think that if the Lord was with him, that everything would be okay. How many of you know that just because God is with you don't mean that he's going to keep you from having to go through some stuff? Anybody else in here ever been through some stuff before? Hopefully you've never been thrown into a pit by your brothers and then sold into slavery, but I mean, there's always that possibility. We are in Pall Mall. But even in the prison that he was thrown into, Joseph, after the warden of the prison saw that Joseph was doing all this stuff right and he was a good and honorable man, the warden started putting everything into Joseph's hand, and he started putting him in charge. And so even in prison, Joseph was running things, and the prison flourished and did well and was orderly while Joseph was in charge of it. And then Joseph was given the interpretations for some dreams of the cupbearer and baker of the Pharaoh. They'd been in prison at that time as well. Basically, if you did anything to tick the king off, you was going to jail or getting your head cut off, one of the two. And so Joseph was given by God these interpretations, and the interpretations came true. The cupbearer was restored to his duty. The baker, unfortunately, was hanged. So Joseph tells the cupbearer to remember him when he gets out of prison. The cupbearer gets out of prison and immediately forgets about Joseph. Good stuff, right? And so Joseph held a grudge. Now, we don't read that. We don't read anything about Joseph's mentality at all. It was 2 more years before Joseph was ever even thought about again by this cupbearer. He sat there for 2 years after he had basically told the man the dream that would restore him and get him out of prison. And then he was forgotten. And the only reason that he remembered then was because the Pharaoh himself had 2 dreams. And so the Pharaoh didn't know what these dreams meant, and he was really concerned about it. So he called all of his smart people together, all of his wise men, all of his magicians. And he asked them what the dream meant. Nobody can tell him. And so the cupbearer then, at that time, oh yeah, there was a guy that that interpreted my dreams for me. And so now that it makes me look good, I can be the hero and rescue the day. Now I'm going to tell the Pharaoh, hey, there was this guy in prison. You need to hit him up. Good stuff, right? So now Joseph is remembered. He's pulled out of prison. He's cleaned up, and he's thrown in front of Pharaoh. The Pharaoh tells him the dream, and Joseph interprets it. He told Pharaoh that there was going to be 7 years of abundance, and then after the 7 years of abundance, there was going to be 7 years of a famine, and the famine was going to be bad. He went so far after that, he advised the Pharaoh, it would be, he said, let Pharaoh put someone in charge of this to make sure that it's done, and make sure that there's grain stored up during the years of plenty, so we'll have enough food when the famine comes. And the Pharaoh said, what better man than the one who's telling me this? And within a minute's time, Joseph went from being in a hole, in a prison, to being second command in the greatest empire in the world at that time. Everybody in Egypt was subject to him. They walked around basically. He had people walking in front of him that when he came through, they would tell everybody, bow the knee. Joseph would come through, and all of Egypt was subject to his command. He was given a wife, he was given great wealth, and he was given the ability to do whatever he saw fit because God was with him. He began storing food, taking 1/5 of all the harvests in the land. He did that for 7 years. So when the famine hit, Egypt was ready with all the food they had stored. Not only Egypt, but all the surrounding countries that were affected with the famine started coming to buy food. So Egypt went from wealthy to crazy wealthy because of this famine. The Pharaoh started gaining all this other land from the people that he ruled over. Well, as I said, all the lands around were stricken as well. That also included where Joseph's brothers and father lived. So his dad, Jacob, sent all of Joseph's brothers to Egypt to buy grain because they were starving. And so there's more of a big, long, drawn-out story after all this. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with this, but I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of what's going on before I get into what I want to say. So after a big, long, and drawn-out story, Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. They didn't recognize him at first. Of course, it had been several years, and he was probably in royal clothes and all this bunch of stuff. After he revealed himself, they were terrified. Why? Well, second in command in all of Egypt is the guy we threw in a pit. That's a problem. Joseph completely and totally forgave them. Would not hold it against their command. Now, it's one thing to not hold it against somebody when they have the same standing as you. But when you can, at a word, have somebody thrown into a prison for the rest of their lives, or their head cut off, or whatever needs to happen, whatever you want to happen, and yet you say, I forgive, that's something. Kind of like what God does to us, right? He forgave them. He made sure they were taken care of. Had their dad, all his brothers, all of Joseph's brothers brought to Egypt, and they lived there for the rest of their lives in peace and prosperity. It is a true happily ever after story. It's a really good. I can't encourage you enough. If you haven't read that story in its entirety, go and read it. It's so cool. There's a few lessons that I want to point out about some of the stuff that God was showing me in that story. Lesson number one, you're going to find yourself in a bad spot. It don't matter who you are. If you think that life is a fairy tale, if you think that life is just meant to be lived and you just kind of go through it and nothing really too awfully bad happens, you're living in a dream. And most of you sitting here today can bear witness to that firsthand. There's no discrimination between rich and poor. Sometimes we get this mentality that the super rich people, they don't have worries. They don't have problems. I have some personal friends who are fairly well-to-do right now, and they're going through an absolute horrible time, and they are handling it very well, I might say. But they are giving glory to God despite the circumstances. But everybody, the poor people go through it, the rich people go through it, the black people go through it, the white people go through it. The Greeks, the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Christians, everybody goes through hard times. What people experience as hard is different for everybody. Thankfully, I've never had to deal with drug addiction. At least not in my personal life. I've had family members. But some people find that extremely hard. Some people, I've got a friend, he's been clean for 30 years, but he was addicted to heroin and meth. And by the glory of God, by the power of God, is now clean from that and has been clean for 30 years. Great guy. But he won't take a Zyrtec for allergies because Zyrtec makes him sleepy and alters his mental status a little bit, and he won't touch it because he don't want to go back. He has to find something that doesn't make him drowsy. Some people struggle with the untimely loss of family members. I personally had that. My mom died when I was 17 years old, and I struggled with that a whole lot. Messed my life up for a little bit. Some people struggle with their past mistakes. Some people sit and think about the stuff that they did 30 years ago and they can't let it go. They're drowned by that guilt. Some people struggle with their family members. Somewhere along the line there's been a divide, and we can't get past that. And it eats us up from the inside out. Some people struggle with their finances. No matter what I do, no matter how hard I try, I can't get the job that I need that will take me past not being able to, or being able to provide what I need for my family or what I would like to have. We all experience different stuff for hardships, but we all have them. The second point, so first you'll find yourself in a bad spot, but my second point is you are responsible for your life. It don't matter what circumstances you're faced with. We have a tendency, and this is kind of an American problem, and it's grown rampant in our churches. We have a tendency to blame everybody. It can't be that we're just placed in this situation, and Lord forbid it might be our fault. But it can't be that we're just placed in this situation and it's not anybody's fault. And it can't be that it's not our fault. It's got to be somebody else's fault that we're here. It's the government's fault. It's mom and dad's fault. It's my wife's fault. It's my boss's fault. I have 84 employees. I hear that a lot. More than I would care to hear that. And I have I've got some of the best people working for me. They're phenomenal. They really are. But I still hear that a lot. We have this ingrained mentality within us that somebody else is responsible for our problems. But we cannot succeed. We can't be like Joseph. Joseph had plenty of people to blame. He had his brothers. Obviously, they're the ones that threw him in the pit. But did you ever stop and think, well, where's Daddy? Dad sent me off to let these people throw me in a pit. My dad let it happen. Well, these Midianites, these Ishmaelites, they're the ones that bought me. They had to see the family resemblance. There was 11 of us around. Surely to goodness they could tell I was like them. Those Midianites, they're to blame. God, where was God in all this? Why did he let this happen to me? And then Potiphar. Potiphar knew what kind of a man Joseph was. He knew that Joseph was an upstanding man. He had to know the character of this man that had blessed him so much. Why did he listen to his wife? And then there was the wife herself. Why would you ruin my life because of something as trivial as this? And where were the servants that day? Those servants should have been there working. If those servants had been there working, I wouldn't have been put there by myself with that woman. See, there's all kinds of people Joseph could blame too. And we can all find excuses for the people that we can blame for our circumstances. Sometimes we do blame ourselves. Sometimes we blame ourselves and sit and wallow in it. We can blame our family, friends, co-workers, bosses, the government. Or you can accept things the way they are, and you can try your best to do right by everybody around you and by God, no matter where you are. It don't matter if you're sitting in a jail cell. It don't matter if you're in the absolute middle of the most despairing situation that you know of. You can make a decision. This is the way it is. Now, what am I going to do about it? What can I do to make it better? And that's what Joseph did. Potiphar's house prospered because Joseph was in it, and the blessing of God was on Joseph. The prison warden prospered when he put Joseph in charge. Egypt flourished, an entire country, when Pharaoh put Joseph in charge. Joseph was a blessing wherever he was because God was with him. That's repeated. Read the story. I mean, it's God was with Joseph. God was with Joseph. God was with Joseph. Otherwise, it would be a self-help sermon. This is not a self-help sermon, by the way. Joseph was a blessing wherever he was because God was with him and because Joseph had the right attitude toward God and the people around him. So number one, you'll find yourself in a bad spot. It happens. Number two, you're responsible for your life no matter what bad spot or good spot you may be in. And number three, don't ever forget this one. If you forget the other two, it's kind of bad, but don't forget this one. While you are responsible for the decisions that you make, you need help to live through those decisions. Like I said before, this is not a self-help sermon. Repeatedly, over and over again, we see the phrase, God was with Joseph. Now, our attitudes have to be right because God is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. But our attitudes and good deeds are not where the blessing comes from. God's where our blessings come from. We can't weather the problems of life well without God because He's our strength and our shield. We're still just one man in the middle of an environment that is quite literally hell-bent on destroying us. We can't look at other people as our enemies. That's a big one. We have to realize that our battle is not with flesh and blood. Ephesians chapter 6 says it's with principalities, with rulers of the darkness of this world, spiritual wickedness in high places. We have to, it's so easy because you can see the person. I can see you sitting there. But you're not my problem. At least I hope not. But even if you were up here in my face, spouting out some kind of stuff about how you, silly old bald-headed man standing up here trying to tell us all this stuff, so on and so forth. It's not you that are attacking me. And that's so hard when you can see the person and you can't see the spiritual problem behind that. But the spiritual problem is what our enemy is. How do we do warfare against that? We pray, we turn the other cheek. We're called to do two things. There are two commandments that Jesus told us are the greatest. Number one, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And number two was love your neighbor as yourself. This is my encouragement to you. Despite your circumstances, despite your hard times, in good times, in bad times, and every other time in between, remember God's with you. Don't neglect Him. Don't neglect your relationship with Him. Don't neglect your relationship with the people around you. You don't have to like them, but you are both called and commanded to love them. And by love them, that means put their well-being above your own. Be the church. Don't just go to church. Be the church. Be the light of the world. Jesus said you are the light of the world. Be that. Quit blaming everybody else or everything else for your problems. If you're doing that, quit it. Take ownership. Deal with the problems as they come up. They're going to come up. Deal with them. Confess your sins. Ooh, there's a hard one. You mean I have to actually tell somebody that I'm not perfect? Listen, folks. I know, you know, everybody else knows. Anybody in here perfect? Anybody in here not sinned? Until you confess things, you can never be free of them. Quit pretending. We're all messed up. Beyond repair except for one. Jesus Christ is the only one that can fix us all. Go make a difference in the world around you. There is nobody in this building right now that is not equipped to make a difference in the people around you. You can absolutely, with the power of God within you, change your environment. People will be in a better position after having met you, if you will do that. That's what you want, right? I want you, after having met me, my goal is for you to have a better life after I leave than before you saw me. Is that your goal? I hope so. Is there anybody that needs prayer for anything this morning? Everybody's good, huh? Is there anybody in the community that we can pray for?